People keep arriving at my door with that expression. You know the one. The tilted head, the too slow blinking, the voice dropped an entire octave lower than their natural register, as though I have suddenly become hard of hearing, simply because I have become old. They sit across from me with their notepads, or their phone cameras, or their nervous hands folded in laps. And eventually, after the pleasantries, after the tea, after they've complimented whatever is hanging on the wall, they ask the question they actually came to ask. Are you afraid? I am 104 years old. I was born in a farmhouse in a county so small it doesn't appear on most maps. In a year when the world was still dizzy from one war and already tilting toward another. I have outlived 2 husbands, 1 of my children, 11 United States presidents, and the particular style of hat that every respectable man once wore on a Sunday. I have watched revolutions from a kitchen window. I have held the hands of people in the final minutes of their lives. I have been the last one awake in rooms where someone I loved had just stopped breathing, and I sat there in the silence afterward, not moving, because I was trying to memorize the shape of the absence they left behind. So when you ask me if I am afraid to die, I want you to understand what you are actually asking. My name is Oleander Voss, and no, I am not afraid. But it took me most of a century to get here, and I think you deserve to know why. Because the fear you are carrying, I can see it on you, don't pretend. It is a weight you don't have to keep lugging around. The fear is making you stupid. The fear is making you small. The fear is costing you things you will never get back. And I am too old and too tired and too honest to sit here and let you go on suffering for nothing. Let me tell you about the first time I truly understood what fear of death was doing to me. I was 43. My first husband, Callum, had been diagnosed with something the doctors said was serious, though they used 12 syllables to say it in a way that seemed designed to prevent you from asking follow-up questions. For 6 months, while Callum was undergoing treatment, I became a person I did not recognize. I stopped eating meals properly. I began calculating obsessively the actuarial likelihood of various catastrophes. I could not fall asleep without running through every conceivable bad ending in my mind, as though rehearsing for catastrophe would somehow protect me from it. I pushed Callum away during those months without meaning to. I was so busy being terrified of losing him that I was not actually present with him. I missed 6 months of a man I loved, because I was too busy auditioning grief in advance. Callum survived as it happened, but those 6 months are simply gone. I cannot retrieve them. That is what fear does. It robs you of the present by forcing you to live in a future that may never arrive. It is the most sophisticated thief in existence because it doesn't even need to take anything real. It just makes you hand things over willingly. Now, let us talk about what I actually know, after 104 years of paying close attention. The first thing you need to understand is that death is not the opposite of life. I know that sounds like something you'd stitch on a pillow and sell at a market, but I mean it in a very specific clinical way. Wasted time is the opposite of life. Numbness is the opposite of life. living in such tight, defensive, fearful crouch that nothing can get in. That is the opposite of life. Death is simply the end of a particular arrangement. The fear of that ending is what actually kills you, slowly across decades, by convincing you to never fully show up for any of it. I have known people who died at 92, having really only lived for about 11 years of it. The rest was management, risk assessment, careful calibration of exposure. They kept themselves so insulated from the possibility of pain that they also managed to stay insulated from the possibility of genuine joy, which is the same tissue, by the way. You cannot selectively numb. I learned that from a neighbor, Przemek, who had survived extraordinary hardships in his early life and responded by becoming almost architecturally defended against feeling anything too strongly for the rest of it. He lived to 92. He was very healthy. He was also, by the end, almost entirely hollow, and he knew it. And that knowing was the one grief he had not managed to keep out. Don't be Przemek. I say this with tenderness. He was a good man. He just never quite let himself be a fully alive one. The second thing I want to tell you is about my second husband, Donat. Donat died 13 years ago. He was 89, and he had been, for the last weeks of his life, declining in the way that very old bodies decline. Not dramatically, not in the way that films have conditioned you to expect, but gently, incrementally, like a tide going out so slowly you almost don't notice the waterline has changed until you look back at where it was. He slept more. He ate less. He became quieter, which anyone who knew Donat would tell you was genuinely remarkable, because the man had opinions about everything, including the correct way to stack firewood, and he had never previously in his life been accused of restraint in sharing them. In his last days, there was a particular quality to the room. I don't have a precise scientific vocabulary for it, but something shifted in the atmosphere around him, some barometric change, and Donat, who had spent 89 years being loudly, argumentatively, gloriously present in every room he entered, became very still. Not vacant, not diminished, still. Like a body of water that has stopped being agitated and settled into its own deep, original nature. He would look toward the window for long stretches. He smiled at things I couldn't see. The morning he died, he turned to me and said, in a voice so calm it has lived in my chest ever since, "It's all right, Oli. It's all right." And then he closed his eyes, and his breathing changed its rhythm, and about an hour later it simply stopped. He was not frightened. I want you to hear that. A man who had been argumentative and vigorous and loud and alive for nearly 9 decades, who had loved life with both fists, was not frightened at the end of it. He looked, if anything, like a man who had just solved a puzzle that had been interesting to work on, but that he was also quite ready to be finished with. I have since spoken with others who were present at the deaths of people they loved, and the accounts are remarkably consistent. The terror that the living project onto dying is almost never confirmed by the dying themselves, at least not in the final approach. The body, it turns out, has mechanisms for this. Evolution or God, or whatever organizing intelligence you prefer. Something built in a process of graceful deceleration. The fear belongs to the observers. The person making the actual crossing is more often than not somewhere beyond it. This is not me telling you that death is easy. It is me telling you that the idea of death is much harder than the event of it, and that we are spending enormous amounts of our lives suffering from the idea of something that will, in all likelihood, be considerably more manageable than we have been imagining. Now I want to talk about the thing nobody wants to talk about. The reason you are afraid of dying is not actually that you are afraid of the moment of death. It is that you are afraid of a life that turned out to mean less than you hoped. Death frightens people because it is a deadline, and deadlines have a way of revealing how much work remains undone. You are afraid of arriving at the end and finding the accounting doesn't add up. All those things you were going to say someday, all those trips you were going to take when circumstances were better, all those repairs in relationships and in yourself that you were going to get around to once the current emergency had passed. Except the current emergency has been followed by another current emergency for 20 consecutive years, and here you are, and the thing you were going to say is still unsaid, and the person you meant to become is still waiting for you to start, and the thought of death is terrifying, not because you fear the darkness, but because you fear the regret. I know, because I have had regrets. I am not going to pretend otherwise. My daughter Sephora and I were estranged for 11 years. 11 years. Over something that, when I try to reconstruct it with the memory I have left, seems so structurally insufficient to account for 11 years of silence that I can barely bring myself to describe it. She had made a decision I disagreed with. I had made my disagreement known in a way that was more about my own fear for her than about respect for her autonomy. And she, who had inherited every ounce of my stubbornness and added several ounces of her own, had responded by closing a door between us that neither of us seemed capable of being the first to open. 11 years. She had a child during those 11 years. My grandchild was 4 years old before I ever held her. What finally broke it was nothing dramatic. I wrote Sephora a letter, not an email, a letter on paper in my handwriting, which by then was already beginning to show its age. I did not defend myself. I did not explain or contextualize or provide the annotated version of events that I had been refining in my head for 11 years. I simply wrote, I have been wrong about how to love you, and I am sorry, and I miss you, and I would like to know you again, if you will allow it. 6 sentences. I could have written them in 11 minutes. I waited 11 years. Sephora called me within a week. She drove 8 hours to see me the following month. We had 12 more years together before she died. She died before me, my girl, which is the thing no parent is built to accommodate. And those 12 years are among the most important of my life. But I cannot get back the 11 before them. They are simply gone. And the thing that cost me 11 years with my daughter was not malice. It was not even genuine conviction. It was pride dressed up as principle. And it is the thing I am least proud of in a life that spans more than a century. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that the fear of death is not something you resolve by making peace with death. You resolve it by making peace with your life. You do the work now. You make the call. You write the letter. You have the conversation that has been sitting in the waiting room of your courage for the last 4 years. You stop performing the version of yourself that is acceptable and start actually being the version of yourself that is true. Because the distance between those two versions, that distance is what generates the fear. The closer you get to the self you actually are, the less terrifying it becomes to think about putting it down. I want to say something about pleasure, because people forget about pleasure when they are being solemn about mortality. I have eaten extraordinary meals. I have stood in weather that was trying to knock me sideways and felt unreasonably exhilarated. I have read books that changed the internal architecture of my mind. I have laughed until I couldn't breathe. The kind of laughter that makes a complete fool of you in public and is absolutely worth it. I have danced badly and often. I have swum in water cold enough to make every nerve ending conduct a brief seminar on the subject of being alive. I have had friendships of such intimacy and duration that they constitute their own category of human experience. I have watched the sun go down over water on more occasions than I can count, and still felt it. Still felt the specific, helpless gratitude of being conscious in a world that occasionally arranges itself into something that beautiful. None of those things are waiting for better conditions. None of them required me to be younger, or thinner, or richer, or more sorted out than I was. They required me to show up. That's all. To be actually present, rather than managing my exposure from a careful distance. Presence is the whole game. I mean that technically. The degree to which you are actually inside your own life, rather than administrating it from a position of defended remove. That is the variable that determines everything else. Not achievement, not accumulation, not the resolution of all your complications before you allow yourself to fully participate. Presence, right now, whatever this moment actually contains. I am tired these days in a way that is different from how I used to be tired. It is not a depleted tired, not the tired of insufficient sleep or overextension. It is a tired that feels, oddly, like completion, like a sentence that has come to its natural end and doesn't need another clause. My body is doing what very old bodies do, which is to say it is gracefully, incrementally, releasing its grip on the project of maintaining itself. I find this less frightening than interesting. I am watching myself with a detached curiosity of someone who has lived long enough to no longer be the most important subject in the room. I have arranged my affairs. I have said what needed to be said to the people it needed to be said to. My granddaughter Riva who is 31 and funnier than anyone in our family has any right to be, visited me last month, and we talked for 6 hours, and then we sat in silence for another hour, and it was one of the finest hours of my life. I told her things about her mother, my Sphora, that Riva had never heard. She cried. I held her hand. We ate cold chicken directly from a bowl on the counter and drank wine she had brought, and neither of us mentioned that this might be one of the last times, because we didn't need to. We both knew. The knowledge was not a shadow over the evening. It was a lamp. It made everything more vivid, more precise, more real. That is what I want you to take with you when you leave here. Not that death is fine. Not that there is nothing to grieve about the end of consciousness and continuity and the particular singular arrangement of a self. These are genuine losses, and the grief is real, and I am not asking you to perform a courage you don't feel. I am telling you that the terror, the paralytic, life-shrinking, presence-destroying terror, is not an appropriate response to the information. The terror is costing you too much. It is extracting payment now, daily, for a debt that will not come due for years or decades. And in the meantime, you are standing outside your own life, waiting for conditions to improve before you consent to actually live it. And conditions are not going to improve in the ways that matter until you decide to stop waiting. Do the work. Say the thing. Take the risk. Be embarrassingly, inconveniently, stubbornly present in the actual life that is happening to you right now, in this body, on this specific, unrepeatable afternoon. That is how you stop being afraid of dying. You fill the life so completely that when the end comes, and it will come for all of us. That is not a tragedy, but simply the nature of the arrangement. You can look at it with the equanimity of someone who showed up, who was actually there, who did not spend the whole party standing near the door, monitoring the exits, calculating contingencies, waiting to be sure it was safe before beginning to enjoy themselves. The party is already happening. You are already in the room. I promise you, from the vantage point of 104 years, it is safe to take your coat off. Go. Put the phone down. Go and live your life. I'll still be here when you need me, but you take your time getting back.